Sten, we're live.
And that's the great Stevie Ray Vaughan leading us into another edition of In the Dugout. I'm your host, Mike Stenhouse, and we welcome you to our show today. And this is a very important show today, whether you're watching live or whether you're watching after the fact. Dr. Bostom has taught us so much about this virus, and it shows us how much the state and medical labs are not being fully open with the people of Rhode Island. And we're going to discuss and ask the critical question, why is the state withholding critical COVID-19 detailed data? Today's show is a special edition. It's part interview like we normally do. As you can see, we've got a panelist of 3 people. It's part press conference, although it doesn't look like the press is interested. And it's going to be part public forum. We're going to ask you, if you're watching live, to put your comments below. And maybe we'll even get to your questions at the end of the show. And as I mentioned, with the media not responding to our inquiries, it's just typical, and it's why we have this show. There's a narrative that the government is putting out that we need to be afraid of every positive test, afraid of everything, and the mainstream media echoes that. The governor and her allies don't want to hear anything else, and you're going to hear something else today. You're going to hear the other side of that narrative today. So again, don't forget to don't be bashful, comment or ascribe below. All right. So first of all, there were 2 recent headlines that spurred our discussion today. The first one, if I can find it, is this. This was today in Go Local Providence. Now it's a little bit over the top. It may not even be true, but Rhode Island does have increasing caseloads, and there's a lot of panic over that. Our talk today will show you that there shouldn't be panic. And the reason being is the second headline, this from the Florida Department of Health, where Florida became the first state to mandate reporting of cycle threshold data. Now, what is that? What is cycle threshold data? Why is it important? That's the purpose of our discussion today. We need to distinguish that all COVID cases are not the same. We need to distinguish cases from actual infections, actual contagious infections. And there's a lot of fear, confusion, and hardship resulting from this lack of knowledge or even lack of attempt to analyze this data. So, that headline may be a little bit over the top, but the government's goal and their friends in the media are to spread fear among the public. We know that positive cases are rising. They want you to think that everyone is Ebola level, but this information is not complete. It does not tell the whole story, and it's designed to keep the public in fear and therefore to justify the unconstitutional and unchecked power that our government is wielding right now. We're going to do detailed interviews with them in just a minute, but a quick hello from Dr. Andrew Bostom. Doctor, hello to our crew.
Hi, Mike. Hi, everybody.
We have State Representative Patricia Morgan, former gubernatorial candidate. Hello, Patricia.
Hi, everyone.
And we have State Worker Jay, who's going to tell us about his personal attempts to obtain this critical data on his own. Hello, Jay. Welcome to In the Dugout.
Hello, everybody.
This is, as we're going to demonstrate, this CT data, which Dr. Bostom will explain in just a second, can be very helpful in designing public policy and informing doctors about how to deal with their own patients who may be testing positive or may be feeling ill. It's critical data because not all positive tests are the same. So we're gonna start in just a minute with Dr. Bostom, who's going to explain what the cycle threshold values are. We're also going to tell you among these three individuals, and I'll reference a fourth who tried to get this information from the government, but they're being stonewalled. Why? Why does the government want to keep us in the dark about this detailed COVID data? So before we get to our first interview with Dr. Bostom, one announcement, and that is that we did start a public petition today. We are announcing today that on our website, which I'm sharing with you right now, if you go to rifreedom.org, we have just right here, you can see we have a petition for COVID transparency. Just go to rifreedom.org. It's right at the top of the page, and you can petition the state of Rhode Island to release this vital information. It might be helpful to you if you ever catch positive or someone in your family tests positive, but it certainly will be helpful to the public when it comes to public policy information to help better shape public policy. So please visit us at rifreedom.org. All right, let's go to Dr. Bostom. You're a regular on our show. Just for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, quickly, your background and experience with COVID and other clinical and research that you've done, doctor.
Yeah, so I'm a clinically trained internist. I trained up here, did my residency at Rhode Island Hospital. I've also got my master's in clinical epidemiology at Brown. I've been a clinical trialist. I actually ran, right out of Rhode Island, I ran the largest clinical trial ever conducted in kidney transplant recipients. And I'm also an epidemiologist. And I don't work clinically any longer, but I have continued to do clinical research. I gave up my clinical practice about 5 years ago. Now
for many months, you've been trying to raise awareness about this issue. Here's a picture of you writing about it back in September. So explain to us, what is a cycle threshold value and why is it important?
So what the test is doing, and I'll try and keep it as straightforward as I can, is SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19 is what's called an RNA virus. That's its genetic code. And what the test does is it amplifies sort of very identifying segments of that RNA, but it does it in a way that produces at a certain range too much magnification, so that you can literally be dealing with meaningless fragments of the virus's genetic material, from sloughed off dead cells that may have been once infected, probably were once infected, but no longer are. And so just let me give you an example. The Center for Disease Control requires that these tests be run through 40 of these cycles, of these amplification cycles. The Broad Institute at MIT Harvard, which handles all the testing for 108 Northeastern universities, including the major colleges in Rhode Island, including URI, including Johnson & Wales, I believe. They've published data which shows that, let's say a person tests positive after 12 cycles. That's equivalent, roughly, to about 2 billion copies of the virus, based on amplifying this genetic material. Conversely, if someone tests positive towards the end of the required number of cycles the test has to go through, at 38, so the end being 40, you're down to 8 copies. That's a
2 billion versus 8.
That's a 250 million fold difference. What's also very important, Mike, is that the reason there can be value to this test is that it's a surrogate. It's a tool we use instead of laboriously taking someone's specimens from the throat, the nose, et cetera, and literally trying to culture the virus out of it. That can take a few weeks. What's been found is that there's a very close relationship, a linear relationship between the cycle threshold and your ability to culture live virus.
Which means how symptomatic you might be or whether you're infectious or contagious.
Well, there are other clinical outcomes that can be, but just in terms of the virus itself, your ability to culture live virus, which of course determines your infectiousness, it's inversely related to the cycle threshold. So in other words,
Right.
when the studies are pooled, it looks like by the time you get above 30 cycle thresholds, it's very difficult to culture live virus. Conversely, it's much easier when you're below 25.
All right. So if I were to say it in layman terms, the cycle threshold measures the viral load, how much of the virus you have. And you could test positive at an absolutely minuscule, insignificant level on the one hand, or you could test positive having a significant amount that's going to lead to individual and community risk, right? If I were to sum it up that way,
right. and viral load, Mike,
the higher the CT value, right, the less virus you have, right?
Exactly, and viral load is actually the technical term that's used. So it's a logical layman's term, but it's the technical term. And the thing that can be confusing to folks is that, again, it's an inverse relationship. So a lower number in terms of cycle threshold is actually potentially more threatening, indicating more virus present.
All right, last question before we go to Jay. In a statement we'll look at, I think, a little bit later from Judicial Watch, who you've partnered with in an APRA request. They say that analysis by the New York Times, and I'm quoting from their statement, an analysis by the New York Times published in August found that in 3 sets of testing data that include cycle thresholds compiled by officials in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, listen to this, folks, up to 90% of people testing positive carry barely any virus. That means that potentially means, I guess, and I want your comment, that 90% of positive tests are people who will barely ever be symptomatic and never be contagious.
Right, and you could translate that into CT, since that's what we're talking about,
right,
that they're probably referring certainly to people above 35, but maybe even to people above 30. Because again, in different laboratories, there's been slightly different cut points used, but everyone. So for example, Dr. Fauci gave an interview on a virology podcast, very, very in the weeds. But basically what he said was that there's no infectious virus present above the cycle threshold of 35. That was Dr. Fauci.
Yep.
Our own head of infectious disease control at Rhode Island Hospital, Dr. Leonard Mermel, did a review back in June and basically cited evidence that above, say, 33, it's really very limited presence of live virus that's there.
All right. So you basically, it's not your theory. This is something that has been corroborated by many people. We're going to come to back to your APRA request later. In fact, we'll pat even yours as well when we get to you. All right, let's go to Jay. Jay is a state government worker. Jay, you tested positive in mid-November.
Yes.
Had to leave your work. You
Yes.
tested positive again in late November, approximately a little over 2 weeks later. But then you started hearing about this cycle threshold, and you wanted to know basically how sick was I? How sick am I? So just quickly, tell us first how severe were your symptoms early on, and then we'll next get into your journey to obtain your own personal medical data. But tell us about your symptoms and how you fully recovered now.
Sure. My symptoms were minor, chills, sore throat, scratchy throat, runny nose, never had a fever. One day I had really bad back pain and joint cramps. Didn't feel like anything like muscle pain or anything. It was very weird, something totally different. And it lasted about 7 to 8 days, and it kind of went away. I did lose my sense of taste and smell. That now has come back. Sense of smell is not fully back yet.
Wow.
And I do think I'm fully recovered at this point. I feel healthy, back to working out, no other issues that I know of right now.
So when did you first learn about cycle thresholds, and why did you feel that was important to you?
I had heard from a number of people that I work with. They were talking about it, and they mentioned Dr. Bostom's name. that he was looking into it, and obviously laying around in quarantine, I started looking online, found some information, some doctors publishing some information about it. And I started getting curious to how sick was I going to be, if this information could help me stay away from my family longer so my family wouldn't get sick. It was kind of an important piece that I really wanted to find out how much of the virus I had in my system. Should my
Right.
wife and daughter and son be really nervous about quarantining or being near me?
So if we build on what Dr. Boston just told us and what Dr. Fauci and others have concerned, even the Dr. Mermel at Rhode Island Hospital, even if you tested positive, but your CT value was in the 30s, you're probably not contagious. You're probably not a threat to your family. The important information for you to know, just on a personal level, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when they test you and they give you the notification that you're positive, they're doing the test and they have that cycle threshold number. It would be very easy just to put positive, what your cycle threshold number is. You can take that to your doctor and evaluate it from there and see what you need to do.
But yet you had quite a bit of difficulty trying to obtain that information. Your own personal medical information was being withheld from you. Quickly tell us very quickly about your efforts there.
I cannot, still to this day, I still cannot get my test results from Dominion. I was told.
Which was the first test you took, right?
Correct. Yes. They sent a woman working there, tried her best. She sent emails to the lab. They basically sent me back an email, which I think I sent you a copy of.
Yep.
Basically telling me that they don't give out that information. Eastside Clinical Lab, which did the second test, jumped through a number of hoops. I did get in touch with a doctor there. He did contact the lab that conducted the test and did give me my result, which was at the time for the second test was 33.26, I think.
So Dr. Bossom, that basically means he's pretty safe, right, at that point?
Yeah. So if we just round it down, say 33, and using the decimal places, it's above 33. That would be around where, particularly at the time, Jay, it correlates with where Jay was, because this is after he had those relatively minor symptoms.
Yeah.
I understand, Jay, that at that point, we actually got the second test. You were basically asymptomatic at that point, right?
Correct. Yes, I was. Yeah. I think that was 14 or 15 days after.
So it'd be very interesting.
So that would be very consistent with the quote clinical picture, which we would never get divorced of what the typical situation is, where you just get a test result. The other thing is, Mike, I did look at the printout that Jay sent me of the lab in Texas. It's called Sonic. It's not the fast food place, but it's called Sonic, that did his test. Just like Dominion is not Dominion Balloting, it's a Dominion company in North Kingstown. They described the test as a quote qualitative test, which means
yes or no, positive or not, right?
Right, exactly, just positive, negative. On the other hand, when pressed, which Jay did appropriately, and this is the message, the real message to the public is do not give up. They have this information, Mike.
Right.
In other words, the test is designed in such a way that the information is always available at some level.
Anyone bothers to or cares to ask for it, right? That's
where you became positive. It's critical where you became positive. So the excuse that he was given by the company in North Kingstown, it just doesn't hold water. They have that information somewhere.
All right, let me get back to Jay, then to Pat, and then we'll circle back and dig in a little deeper on some of this stuff. And I want to come back to that point you just made, Dr. Boston. So Jay, knowing that this is just a matter of 8 or 9 days ago. You got when did you actually get the results? Today is what is today? I don't even know what today is. What's today? Wednesday the 9th. You got your results when?
I think I finally got the results from Eastside on the 4th.
All right, because your last test was positive, right?
Correct, on the 1st. Yep.
On the 1st.
Yep.
But now you know that you're pretty safe, and that must be very comforting you.
Yes, it is. It absolutely is.
So I want you to think. So let's go over to Patricia now. Representative Morgan, sorry. You're a friend, but I got to call you by your name. Just think of this. Think of the students who are being quarantined in dorm rooms. Think of the people who are missing work. Think of the children not able to see their parents or purposely locking themselves at home, like I did with my kids this week. And none of them were positive, but somebody near them was positive. I think of my mother-in-law, who's in an assisted living facility. They just announced some positive tests in the facility, but it would be very helpful to know if those positive cases were actually infectious or not. Patricia, this is pretty important public information, isn't it?
Incredibly important. Obviously, anytime we're making decisions that affect people's lives, they should be based on data, not on raw emotions. And it seems to me that our officials so far are acting out of a need to be seen to be doing something. They're taking charge. But if you're not taking charge based on real data, you're actually could be hurting people.
Well, I thought we were doing data-driven decisions.
Excuse me?
Aren't we? Aren't we supposed to be doing all data-driven decisions up there at the State House?
You know, they say that, but clearly, if they're not collecting this information, they're not. And just think about it. Somebody could be completely non-contagious, but we're sending contact tracers after them. And then contact tracers after everybody they have touched or have been close to. So we have all these people that we're quarantining. They're not going to work. They're not seeing friends. Our state's in a lot of trouble, and it could be compounded by them not paying attention to the data.
Well, and then think at a larger level. You know, we talked about Jay, how important it is, and Jay also mentioned to me also, imagine if he was having symptoms. Imagine if he was in the hospital. Would it be really helpful for his doctor to know at what level of infection he had so they could prescribe the right treatment regimen, whether we had to go aggressive or we could probably sit back? I mean, that would be pretty helpful to know, I would think. Or whether even his symptoms were caused by the coronavirus.
No, I don't think it's just that it's helpful. It's critical.
Critical, yes. Now, from a public policy
about anyone's health to
right,
know
now,
all of the
yes.
information.
Yeah, I mean, again, that blows my mind that your own personal medical data is being withheld from you, even when you personally ask. All right, now, Patricia, as a lawmaker, Representative Morgan, I should say, think about this from a major public policy. If in Rhode Island, like they reported in those other studies, that 90% of the positive tests are basically harmless, contagious. Wow. I mean, that puts a whole different picture on whether or not we should be having lockdowns, whether we should be having restrictions on capacity. I mean, this is big.
Think about how we are we are just wreaking havoc on our economy, on people's mental health, on schooling for our children. I mean, kids are now missing half a year, more than half a year of schooling.
Right.
Whole year before they get back to school. They will struggle to make up this year. It will affect their lives forever. And if it's based on the fact that only 10% of the people who are tested positive are actually infectious, it's shameful that our officials, our elected officials, are not asking for this information and using it to make those decisions.
All right, so
Mike, can I weigh in on a public health issue
Sure.
that's been dealt with by the biggest country in the world?
Sure.
And a country that combines both being, developed, westernized, and not, which is India. So India, has 1.4 billion people. Several months ago, and again, this may not be universally applied in India, but it's in their press. It's being done in at least parts of India. The idea was that let's make use of the cycle threshold data, and let's use it as a form of triage, so that we can, again, it's a massive country with limited resources, So what they decided was it's going to be a very simple algorithm, a very simple protocol. If you test positive and you have at a cycle threshold that's less than 20, particularly if you're age 50 and have any comorbidity, particularly diabetes, they argued to admit you at least for observation. If you
Because you could have a severe case, right? Right.
If you tested positive between 20 to 25, you would be kept in contact with the medical care system by virtue of a nurse practitioner or equivalent. They didn't even consider tests above 25 in terms of their triage. Now, when you look at what's been done in the United States, which would be somewhat consistent with that, and remember, they're all different testing platforms, and you're constantly hearing the argument from people who don't want to share the data, but our PCR test is not exactly the same as theirs in terms of, what the cycle thresholds mean. In the United States, 34,000 nursing home residents in Massachusetts and staff were tested by the same company that's testing the major universities in Rhode Island and Northeast. And what they found is that for that entire population of over 34,000 nursing home residents or staff, that up to a cycle threshold of 26 positive accounted for 99.99% of the total virus that was in that population, and above 26 accounted for 0.01%. So going back to what's being done in India, you begin to see the clinical, reasoning behind that.
Well, and this data, as I think, as Representative Morgan was suggesting, can be used to formulate more targeted, less intrusive, and more effective public policy, just like India's doing, right? I mean, this is the point here. We may not need to be having these mass lockdowns of everybody when the data is there to distinguish about who's sick and who's not. All right, I want to go on to the next topic. And
can I just say,
okay, yeah.
Dr. Boston said India has limited resources. All government has limited resources. And Rhode Island has limited resources. So we need to make sure that we have the data and we're using it to make sure that it's an efficient use of our resources, that we get people back to work as quickly as possible.
And think of it practically. Tomorrow, the governor is going to hold her weekly press conference. She's obviously not going to be happy with the rising cases. We don't know how severe those cases are or not. She's likely to extend or even further deepen in intrusive lockdown measures. And she's doing it blind of this data. Just think about that. The data is there that could directly impact decisions that should be made, and the government is ignoring it. Not only will they not release it, I don't even think they're collecting it or analyzing it. That is criminal.
Well, Mike, in Florida, it took an order of Governor DeSantis.
Thank you, Florida,
to insist that the Florida Department of Health receive not just the positive test results, because state departments of health get these results. This is kind of unique to coronavirus.
Do you think the CT values are being sent to our state right now?
No. What Governor DeSantis had to do is insist that the labs provide not just the positive test, but the cycle threshold at which they tested positive. But that now means that the Department of Health cannot pretend that they don't have these data. They have it. And of course, the Department of Health, being the Department of Health, it's pretty soon going to be in the public domain, at least in terms of overall statistics.
Great. And we want Rhode Island. That's what our petition is about, for Rhode Island to follow suit. Go to rifreedom.org. The petition is right there at the top. This data needs to come out so we can have more accurate, accounting of the data, more data-driven decisions. Let's go to data. Jay, did you submit any kind of formal records requests to any government entity, or you just contact the labs personally on your own?
I started by calling the lab first, and then I decided to put an email in to just have a paper trail to try to get the test results.
Did you ever contact anyone at the Department of Health or the government or anything like that?
I did contact the Department of Health, especially when they contacted me about my test results. A lot of the people at the Department of Health didn't have any idea what cycle threshold is.
Jeez, wait a minute. Say that again.
The people that I talked to at the Department of Health did not have any idea what cycle threshold is.
Is this acceptable, folks?
Ooh.
That the biggest pandemic of our lifetime, that's causing the most economic and societal harm and medical harm in our lifetime, and officials at the Department of Health don't know about this critical information. What does that say? They don't even know what it is.
Yeah, it's
Patricia,
crazy.
is that acceptable? You're a lawmaker. You're an equal co-branch of government. What do you say about something like that?
They need to start collecting it, and they need to start making decisions based on it. I'll put in the bill. I'll put in the law for it.
All right, let's get to that in a second. All right, so Jay, you didn't put in a formal records request. You did contact the government. They went, I don't know what you're talking about. But Andy, and then we're gonna do. You guys did. You and Representative Morgan did put in formal APRA request, which stands for Access to Public Records Act. Andy, tell us about, Dr. Bostom, tell us about your partnering with Judicial Watch and your APRA request.
Well, it stalled at the point of payment, basically. So what Judicial Watch and myself, what we put together was a request, because we knew, think of the state of play in Florida, where it took an order from Governor DeSantis to insist that the labs supply the information to the Department of Health. So we anticipated that the Department of Health might say that, well, we don't have the data from the individual labs that are actually doing the tests. So what we also requested was the correspondence, because why would that decision have been made? So we were, it was a more broader reaching information request. We wanted all the correspondence about the subject of cycle thresholds, in addition to any data that might have been available, even if it was like a pilot project to see if it was of value.
So on
and
the
all
screen,
we were told, Mike, was, pony up $3,000.
And they tell you that doesn't even guarantee you that you'll get anything.
Exactly. In other words, they wouldn't give us our free hour of their time to say, well, gee, we're not sure we have much, if anything, of this, in terms of actually tabulated data, but just pony up the $3,000.
Or take your case to the court and go to the judiciary.
To waive the fee. Go to court to waive the fee. Pay a court fee to waive the fee.
And this is a governor and a governor who says they're the most transparent in history. And look at this stonewalling. They've already used, I think back in June, the governor issued an executive order that because of COVID, we can't respond to public records requests as quickly. And they given themselves months and months and months of time to respond, or like happened to you in Judicial Watch, or asked to impose thousands of dollars for requests. Now, Representative Morgan, when you were not representative, you were often asked to pony up big money for standard records requests. Tell us when you submitted your form, what you asked for, and what their response to you was.
Oh dear, I don't remember the date, but I have gotten I got a response back after the 10 days on the 10th day, which the 10th day was, I think, December 1st. And they said they need another 20 days to give me that information. Obviously, they're not asking me for the money. I am now a legislator. And we have, because of my issues with the Attorney General, legislators no longer have to pay for public documents.
But they can still stonewall you for time, can't they?
Oh yeah, they're stonewalling me. It's just funny. You mentioned that they keep saying that they're the most transparent. They are allergic to transparency in this administration. Absolutely allergic. You have to fight for every single thing that you get from them. Fight for it. And they will use every method of stalling. And that's also what's tragic. This is a crisis for our state. This is a crisis. I mean, I walked door to door. I met the families who are worried that they're going to lose their house because they haven't been able to work. And even though they're on unemployment, it's not enough to pay all the bills. So this is a real crisis, and they're stalling. Why? Why?
Well, a cynic like me
Have the
would
data
say,
out there, make
Yep.
good decisions.
a cynic like me would say it's because they want to keep the public in fear. If 90% of those positive tests are harmless, as it turns out, which really, I guess another way to say they really should be negative, they can build a case for why they need to impose more control over our lives and maintain this, what I've called tyrannical, unchecked, unconstitutional powers. It's not designed for one person, one executive branch to rule without balance of government. And you're Representative Morgan, you're in the
Mike, could I
legislature,
throw in a
and I hope your
caveat?
colleagues, hold on, Andy, I hope your colleagues learn and stand up. They have the power to undo these executive orders in the state of emergency, and they're abusing it now. By ignoring this data, they are abusing their power. Go ahead, Dr. Bostom.
No, just a caveat about the 90% figure. I mean, I recall the New York Times article was in August 29th, and they were citing data, particularly from New York. At that point, there are ebbs and flows to this outbreak, to this epidemic. That was a period of time where there was less viral activity in the community for whatever, a number of reasons. But regardless, that doesn't change the benefit of having the cycle threshold data. And in fact, many have argued that it's a good barometer for how intense a phase you're in of the epidemic. So in other words, if that percentage drops from 90 to 80 to 70 are in this range, which is trivial, then that tells you things are heating up. So it's a good way to monitor the population.
Yes,
but the other thing that we have to keep in mind, particularly here in Rhode Island, and I just reviewed this again today because it's a very impressive way that the outbreak has, it just shows you who's been affected in this state in terms of the one metric that no one can argue about, which is death. And 60% of the deaths in this state have occurred in those who are 80 years old or greater. That is at or slightly above, just barely above, the average life expectancy in this state. 27% of the deaths from COVID-19 have occurred in those who are 90 and above. Whereas if you look at the entire population, unselected with regard to comorbidity, the entire population who are less than 70 in this state accounts for only 17% of the deaths. Yep. So 27% in those above 90 or 90 or above, less than 17% in that entire group, less than 70, who are the working people of the state.
And wouldn't it be interesting to know what their CT values were? I
mean,
exactly. that would be a tremendously interesting analysis.
Mike,
can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Jay.
Well, it's interesting when you're talking about these cycle threshold numbers, because if I never was tested the first time, just thought I was sick, never got tested, dealt with it, and then got this second test, I came back positive, I didn't have any symptoms, and my cycle threshold level was 33. Technically, I'm not contagious right now. I would have worked through the virus, never got tested that first time, and everybody associated with me would be quarantining, not going to work. I would be out of work and stuff like that. With this number, it has to show something, and I'm not a doctor, so.
Yeah. Before we get to Rep. Morgan, let me ask you this, Jay, because I want to stay on access to the data just for 1 second. How do you feel as an individual?
It's crazy.
Being denied access to your own medical data. How frustrating was that to you?
It's horrible. I actually was talking to the woman, and and again, she was very polite, but she asked me, why do you want this data? You already know you're COVID positive, you're recovered. What do you need this data for? And I'm like, it's a piece of the puzzle for my medical history, my medical doctor. If something happens to me down the road, they can look at it and say, okay, at this time, maybe I was in the 20s. And then the second test showed I was at 33. What that has to show something, and they will not give it to me.
And it's your right.
Correct.
I mean, beyond any practical, it's your right.
Yep.
No, and that's being
I've said
denied
that.
to you. Just think about that. Rep. Morgan, go ahead.
I did want to ask Dr. Bostom a question. If you are testing positive at the 35 level, have you developed immunity at that point? I would assume that if you were positive earlier, your cycle threshold was 5, 6, 10, whatever. So if your threshold gets up to 33, 35, are you at that point, have you developed immunity? You're no longer infectious.
Well, Representative Morgan, a lot of people have argued that those very, very high cycle thresholds, positive, so-called positive tests at the limit of the cycles that they run, are almost equivalent to like getting an antibody test in many people. In other words, that they are perhaps just a surrogate for a past infection, even if it's a relatively recent past infection that you've gotten over. And yes, isn't that kind of like, being tested for antibodies in your blood, in your serum? And, it's possible. The other thing that's a real possibility, though, is that any test has a false positive rate.
Sure.
And when you're dealing, particularly in times of low disease prevalence, we could argue that's not true now, but in terms of low disease prevalence, that's always a possibility. And the other possibility is, I've seen some European data where they did some very interesting things before they authorized the same type of testing procedure in Europe. And what they did is, you always do negative controls, like just, plain water, and test that. And hopefully they're all negative when you do your trial run for this PCR assay. Well, they did something even more clever. They spiked in the common cold causing human coronaviruses, and they wanted to get 0 for that too. They didn't. They got 3%.
Yep.
So there's a lot of common cold causing coronaviruses that are always around. And they start increasing this time of year. And if you're getting some cross reactivity with that, that's another possibility to consider.
I guess the reason I asked from a public policy perspective is we're going to have a limited number of vaccinations coming into Rhode Island in the beginning. And if we knew that somebody was cycling at higher rates, could we give this vaccine? So they've already have immunity. We could delay giving them the vaccine and give it to people who are still negative.
If you were going to employ that strategy, Representative Morgan, it would probably
just asking.
No,
yeah.
It would be probably, if you were thinking along those lines, even forget about employing the strategy, you would probably just go directly to antibody testing, which is the traditional way to establish past exposure. And then that can be more refined and see if people have the kind of robust immunity that we're looking for in the whole vaccination process itself.
All right. And I want to bring it back to something, Jay, you provided to us in our discussion and in your email. We're told not to go get your last test was positive, right? Even though high threshold cycle, low viral load level, but you were told not to test again for 90 days. Tell us about that.
Yes, based on what the CDC and the Department of Health is instructing me to do is I'm not to perform another COVID test for 90 days after my 10 days of quarantining.
So let's talk about that. To me, that's stunning. What that tells me, because don't forget, Dr. Fauci, the famous Dr. Anthony Fauci, also made a quote about CT that when you have a high cycle threshold, which means you have a low amount of the virus, that you might be testing positive or something he just called dead nucleotides that might be in your nasal cavity. Harmless, dead but you could still test positive. So think about it in your case. Think about if you didn't know your CT data and you got tested again in 2 weeks, no symptoms, you could still test positive because those dead nucleotides apparently can live in your system or remain in your system, and I guess they don't live if they're dead, but they could remain in your system for up to 90 days, which is why they don't want you to test it. But let's assume you tested positive in 2, you'd still be positive. You'd have to go back on quarantine again, miss work, miss seeing your family if you didn't know your CT level. This is how critical this data is. Is there anything I'm getting wrong there, Dr. Bostom?
Well, I think it's also, isn't it sort of basically, a tacit or open recognition that this phenomenon exists, that we know you're going to continue to test positive. You're asymptomatic. You're okay. God bless you. Go back to work. Don't test again. I mean, and that's the way. That's the rational way. We should have been dealing with this from the beginning, because the other big problem that this mass testing asymptomatic people introduces is that you're labeling them. There's literally a diagnostic code now for being asymptomatic and testing positive. That's a disease code. This is absurd. And unfortunately, Mike, this has real ramifications. Let's say a patient is admitted for an elective gallbladder procedure at Rhode Island Hospital, and as part of their screening, they test positive. Okay, they're totally asymptomatic in terms of any respiratory disease, et cetera. They have a gallbladder problem. It's being dealt with, and God forbid something goes sour and they wind up in the ICU. Well, not only they're now a COVID ICU admission. God forbid the worst case scenario, the person expires. They're a COVID death.
Yep. All right. I want to ask one more question on that to Dr. Then Patricia, I want to ask you what you may be prepared to do about this when you go into session next month. So, and then we'll open it up. Well, this question to you, Doctor, is, by the way, while the media may be ignoring us today, we've got a really good active viewing audience who are making tons of great comments. One of those comments, I can't remember the name, from Joseph Gabriel, it looks like. Can the CT test be performed forensically? In other words, if somebody was tagged as a COVID death, if they had comorbidities, could you go in and test and say, wow, this person only had a CT value of 35. They obviously weren't heavily infected. Could that help determine whether COVID was actually the cause of death or not?
In other words, an autopsy or something like that?
Yeah. Could you test them after the fact in an autopsy and still find out, before everything dies away, and find out their viral load? And wouldn't that help determine what caused the death?
Sure, but the point is, Mike, that everyone that's admitted to the hospital is being tested for COVID. So you wouldn't have to do it post-mortem. But
if somebody had a heart attack and died, and they happen to have
you mean at home or something like that?
Anywhere, happen to have a low viral load.
But what I'm saying is
COVID death.
The mass testing has made that almost unnecessary, because everyone that's coming into medical contact and certainly admitted to a hospital or an emergency room is being tested. So but in theory, yes, if the person had died at home and it looked by all accounts to be a heart attack, a stroke, a sudden arrhythmia, something like that. And I don't know why they would test for COVID, but they could do it post-mortem.
But I think, right. Dr. Boston.
Go ahead, Pat.
Okay. I guess the point is we are labeling all of these deaths as coronavirus deaths. And if somebody actually had a CT of 33 or above and had the heart attack, would they still be considered a coronavirus death, or just
should they be considered?
Should they be?
Well, they could be. They could be.
But why? If they're above 33, we're already saying it was kind of a non-issue in their medical.
Let's say that's speculative.
There's another, Mike. There's another breakdown in this system. Okay, so and this was also addressed by Florida, coincidentally. Florida did an audit of at the time 14,000 death certificates in the state of Florida. And what they revealed was how the system had been broken by the CDC. Very simply, there's two parts to a death certificate. One deals with causality, in this case, if you're focusing on COVID, and the other part deals with comorbidity. See, there's been a firewall traditionally up until last spring between those two parts. CDC destroyed that firewall. It destroyed its own previous procedures. So now, let's say a person was admitted in the spring for COVID, thank God, did okay with it, but it's now part of their medical record. That comorbidity could be now linked to a new hospitalization that has nothing to do with COVID, and it could be adjudicated as a COVID death because it's now
And they're
a
gonna go
chronic
down as a COVID
comorbidity
death.
of this person. This is
Even if
another
they have
huge process.
recovered.
We need an audit
Okay.
of death certificates in the state of Rhode
Yeah,
Island
yeah.
too.
All right. All right, let me ask Jay, let's go to you. So we're not saying where you live, where you work, anything like that, but you have a state rep, you have a state senator who represents you. We have a state lawmaker here in Representative Morgan. What would you ask of your elected official who represents you? What would you ask them to do about this? And then we'll have Representative Morgan answer that and what she's prepared to do legislatively when the session opens up in January. So, Jay, what can public officials do about this?
I would hope step up for not only me, but everybody else out there. There's data out there, there's doctors, people well above me saying that this information is critical to treating, helping people that test positive for COVID. To have that, to help with people with symptoms, to help with the economy, with help with people's jobs, with help people's anxiety, with families. I would just hope that the representatives, anybody in government would step up and say, okay, we're here for the people. Let's look at this data. It may or may not help. I don't know, but at least look at it. It's a possibility that could save a life, could help the economy, could help people keep their houses.
Rep Morgan, what are you thinking of doing?
Well, first of all, let me say I'm troubled that it appears either that they haven't been collecting the cycle threshold data or that they've been ignoring it when they've been making decisions. And that is the governor and the Department of Health. It's just malpractice when we look at the damage that it is doing to Rhode Islanders. But we go in the second Tuesday in January, and from this conversation, for sure, I'm going to ask them to collect, publish, and use the cycle threshold data. They have to do it.
Do you think you can get bipartisan support on that?
Excuse me?
Do you think you can get bipartisan support on that? We know how this
I
Democrat
think so.
General
I'm hoping
Assembly,
so.
will if it comes from Republican now, we're not going to listen to it.
Well, we'll see. We'll see whether the Democrats are willing to let our state continue to suffer when there is this important piece of information that might alleviate some of the damage that the coronavirus is actually doing to our state.
And again, we want to remind
an audit of the death certificates as well.
Yeah, that too. We want to remind everyone that Florida has taken this step. Florida Governor DeSantis has now mandated that the Department of Health start collecting, and I assume reporting this data. I wonder if they've been looking at it or analyzing it in before, publicly making this, and that's led because, Florida's been one of the more open states, right, when it comes to not doing lockdowns and everything. And while they did have that spike in the summer, they were very good before. They seem to be doing much better now. I wonder if any of that data might have guided their decisions behind the scenes. I don't know. And now they're just looking for more comprehensive collection.
Let
What do
me
you
just
think,
say
Doctor?
their unemployment rate is 6%, which is, it's high, but it's not nearly as high as it is here in Rhode Island.
Right.
Every percent of unemployment rate, there is pain.
As Jay said, this data could really help the economy and people with jobs. Jay, that was a great point you made. Doctor?
Representative Morgan, I would make a special appeal to the K through 12 and college students in this state that their data their data. You know, when they rejected our initial information request, we went back to them and said, could you please, in your hour that you give us for free, at least send us the distribution of the cycle thresholds in those 400 tests at the time, I think there's more now, of the elementary school, K through 12 school kids that had tested positive. Because to demonize, to isolate children is the cruelest form of punishment. Since I have to say, as an epidemiologist who's reviewed the data, children are at much lower risk, certainly K through 12 children are at much lower risk from coronavirus, from COVID-19, than they are from, forget about pandemic flu, from seasonal flu, by multifold. And so the idea that these kids are being deprived of school and are being demonized as spreaders of this disease, which they don't do, by the way, it's critical that we understand what the cycle thresholds are in this population that's being punished.
All right, I want to go to our viewers. I want to just point out a statement and then a question that has been posted here. So first of all, John Mello makes a good point. I'm going to put his point into my words. The mandate by Governor DeSantis in Florida, that's the way government should issue mandates. Mandates to help determine what the best course of public policy is, right? Versus mandates like we're seeing from this governor, where she's just totally guessing, not on data, imposing mandates on it that restrict our freedoms. Governor DeSantis has imposed a mandate so he can find out data to justify why people should be allowed their freedom. I mean, do you see the difference in how government should work? I mean, great comment by John Miller. All right, we have a question, and I don't know, Doctor, I guess this would go to you, or if you don't know, just say so. How has Florida incorporated consideration of CT values into their COVID testing protocol? So do you know exactly how they're going to do it? I guess the question is, does this data already exist at the lab, and they're just saying,
yes,
give it to us?
yes,
yeah. They have to change the way they test.
Mike, I think actually at a certain level, the request for data was almost too lenient. Apparently, some of the labs can sign a release claiming that they only have qualitative data, but the idea is that most of the platforms, I would argue virtually all of them, have this data available. Some have it more available than others. And that he wants it to accompany all the tests, go to the Florida Department of Health, and then I think it has to be de-identified. I mean, you can't publish individuals' data just like they don't do for positive tests. But when they come out and say, oh, we had a bad week, there were X number of, there were 1,000 positive tests or something like that, they'll say, oh, okay, well, this percentage tested at a cycle threshold less than 20, this percentage 21 to 25, this percentage 26 to 30, this percentage 31 to 35, and this percentage above 35.
Yep.
And they'll present the beautiful curve.
Yeah, it would be
and
great public
information.
Great information. Jay.
Yep.
You persisted, you pressed, you found that one of the labs had the data and was willing to give it to you. The other lab has not yet responded. You get the sense that they have the data and just won't give it to you, your CT value, or do you think that they don't have it? What is your sense of the situation?
Absolutely, I think they have it. It was funny. I was just looking at a piece of paper in one of the emails that I wrote to them, asking about the thing they mentioned about what the doctor said about the qualitative. We cannot report this out. Take care. So I responded back with them and just asked about how many cycles do you routinely run on your PCR tests?
Right.
And they came back with, they run 40 cycles. Take
Right.
care. So
Right.
they're telling me that they're running the 40 cycle test. They're telling me that they have the number, and then they're not giving me the information. And
Mike,
it's crazy.
Mike and Jay knows this already, but that's the whole point. In other words, even the Sonic non-fast food lab that sent him his actual result down to 2 decimal places. When you read the printout before they gave them the result, it says, "Oh no, it's just a qualitative
It's
test."
maddening. It's maddening.
They said it's just a qualitative test. So, and I happen to know personally that Dominion Labs in North Kingstown, because of a previous inquiry about URI students, they absolutely have the cycle threshold data. As a matter of fact, there was a negotiation on about potentially doing research with them using the cycle threshold data.
But I still can't get my information.
All right, we're gonna close here, but I'm gonna just ask just a quick appeal to each of you. Dr. Bostom, you'll come back, I assume, on our show regularly and update us on this and other COVID-related information. You're the one that broke this story in the state. It's starting to make news locally. We know some of the talk shows are on it. We know that nationally it's become a headline. I think it's because of you. I think it's because the article you wrote in September demanding this, and it's starting to make its way. So thank you for that, and you'll come back and join us, right?
Sure, anytime.
All right, Jay, and likewise, would you update, come back, not for a whole hour, but maybe just for 5 or 10 minutes sometime, and give us an update on your situation, your success. I would suggest you contact your state rep, your state senator, tell them, why can't I get access to my own personal medical data? And then tell all your friends to sign our petition at rifreedom.org. So Jay, would you be willing to come back and update our viewers?
Absolutely, I'll come back, and if hopefully I'll be able to press Dominion a little bit more and get that result. But I would just ask our elected officials, Democrat, Republican, put that aside and just represent the people, because everybody is suffering right now, and too many people have lost lives to this, and it's just really sad. And I just want it to end.
Thank you, Jay, for your persistence. Thank you for being a vigilant citizen standing up for your rights. Thank you very much. And Patricia, there's not much I can do about it. There's not much doctor can do about it. Jay, as a citizen, maybe do a little, but you've got some oomph in the legislature. Will you
I'm on it.
Would you pledge to this audience you won't let this issue go?
No, I'm on it, and I'll let you know what happens.
You're involved in public policy. This is critical for individual rights and for mass public policy. So listen, if you're watching live or if you're watching on replay, please subscribe to our channel so you can get notifications of other upcoming live events that are going on with our In the Dugout show or other shows from our Center for Freedom and Prosperity. You can still continue to make comments, even if you're watching secondary. Wow, what a great discussion panel. What a great discussion on a critically important issue that we are now bringing to light. And hopefully this show will have some impact on public policy on our state. So
Mike, thank you very much for hosting this. It's very important and courageous of you to have done this.
I learned a lot, and I'm encouraged by the persistence of citizens like Jay and the future persistence of lawmakers, real freedom fighters like Representative Morgan and all of us. So thank you all. And for In the Dugout, and by the way, I forgot, we're in the dugout. I forgot to wear my hat, so I'll wear it for 2 seconds as we say goodbye. For In the Dugout, Dr. Bostom, for Jay, for Representative Morgan.
I slipped my hat on for a second.
Okay, good for you. We'll see you next game. Thank you all.